It's worth noting that Suffragette is not a film targeted towards the male demographic. It is hardly astonishing that these former autocratic oppressors would be so inclined to attend a film that depicts men as callous persecutors with an inherent lack of empathy towards the female population.
So, I know I haven't done a movie review in forever, but my history teacher made me watch this movie for extra credit, and I felt the need to talk about it. This might turn into a bit of a rant. I'm sorry, but I really just needed to get this off my chest. Let me just be very clear. I don't understand why people like this movie. For starters, why? Why does everyone love this bland piece of wood's acting so bloody much? She looks the same in every single scene. Why? Don't get me wrong. There are some good performances in here, but not this piece of stale bread. Sorry, I had to get that off my chest. I really hated her performance, and everyone seemed to love it, and this pissed me off. I will now move on to the more quote-unquote intellectual, this is not a very intellectual video, reasoning we can all take with us as film writers, which is surprisingly a flaw that I don't see reviewers mentioning when discussing this movie, which is so odd to me because it's the thing that stood out to me the most. And it's getting your audience to like your main characters. Now, don't get me wrong, I have nothing, not a thing, against flawed characters. For those of you who don't know, my favorite protagonist of all time is Light Yagami, who is arguably the villain of his story, so let's just say perhaps not the most altruistic of people. Your main characters can do morally questionable, even morally despicable things, and still get the audience to root for them. Even in a movie like Suffragette, which obviously wants its heroes to be seen as morally correct, considering the movement that they're part of, you can still have its main characters do morally questionable things, but not the way that this movie chooses to execute it. So, you know what? Let me give you a little bit of a story, and I just want you to see what you're starting to think about the story that I'm presenting to you. Okay? So a woman walks down a street by some nice, innocent-looking shops. As she's walking peacefully, suddenly she hears screaming, and somebody's breaking the poor shop owner's windows with rocks. People are frightened, and the woman goes home scared. Pretty simple story. How do you feel about the woman throwing the rocks? Does she seem like a good person? Well, that is practically the transcript for the opening scene of Suffragette, and the woman throwing rocks is one of the main characters I, as an audience watcher, am supposed to care about. I'm sure this will be repeated somewhere in this script, but if you want your audience to like your characters, do not introduce them with an action that is perhaps not the greatest. Especially if you are never going to give an explanation or reason why that action was morally just. And no, because it's part of a greater movement, is not a justification. While sure, if you were doing a documentary, I'm sure it would look like suffragettes threw rocks in many innocent people's buildings, but that's not the story these filmmakers are trying to tell. And I know it's not the story they're trying to tell, because this isn't a documentary, but more rather a character study on what these women might have been like, along with some other reasons I'll discuss later. But my point still stands is that each woman in your film should have a reason for the building that they're targeting, and by not even telling, let alone showing the reasons, is just poor storytelling. And it also, there's even a bigger problem with this, and it's that setting your characters up this way, they're at a disadvantage of getting your viewers to like them. I mean, unless your viewers are violent and really support destruction of property, but I highly doubt that. And while they can, and I believe in Suffragette, the woman in question, Victoria, kind of does make up for their first impression, it's just so much extra work that's unnecessary that you have to do as a filmmaker when you could just introduce them and get the audience to like them before having them do morally reprehensible things. Especially when you're then supposed to feel bad for them going to jail for protesting, when you're like, sure, they shouldn't have gone for that, but the breaking of buildings had no repercussions, so, I mean, let's just call it karma. Like, it's almost as though the film's scenes should have been placed backwards, where you saw them getting beat up for nothing, and then they went and took to the streets and were violent, which I'm sure is what happened historically, but according to the film, it would appear the other way around. And I know that the screenwriters of this film know how to properly explain the motives behind characters. And I know that they know this, and they're so smart, because they give us a perfect example of how to do it when they bomb George Lloyd's summer house. This is the perfect. It should be studied on how to get your characters to do morally reprehensible things and have your audience still root and support them. Okay? George Lloyd has been established to the audience as, I have a different word in my script, but I'll just say not the nicest person, and someone who deserves some karma, who also has a personal connection to Maud, who's the protagonist of the story. And that gives the audience so much leeway when it comes to what the characters are doing. And then the screenwriters even bothered to go the extra mile by having Edith, who was one of the leaders of the suffragette movement there in that location, explain that they were very careful to make sure no one was going to get hurt. That's how you get your characters to do something wrong, but have your audience understand and not think of it as an evil or morally unjust action. Not having them opening up, doing random acts of violence, making them look like psychopaths. And maybe this was all done to add question to the morality of militant practices, I hear you asking. After all, didn't that one guy, who I'm not sure was even given a name, briefly discuss how innocent people get caught in the crossfire when a servant almost got blown up when they blew up George Lloyd's house? And you, person asking me this question, you might even have a point. However, the authors knew what they were doing by having the argument against the characters be an example given verbally that didn't even fully happen, which is particularly noticeable considering there are multiple examples that were actually shown in the movie of how their actions are a bit overly destructive. But no, it chooses to verbally explain to you a half example. So I know that they want you to certainly pick one side and aren't truly diving in to this questioning. So I know the writers are smart enough to know how to manipulate an audience, and I know that sounds like a bad thing, but I mean it as a good thing. There's not actually anything wrong with manipulating your audience to feel more agreement towards one side, even if that's one that they might not normally looking at it objectively. But somehow they're not smart enough to catch things like character introductions being poor, or the next example I want to give you, which is just atrocious. It is so bad. Okay? While that opening example made the first couple of minutes hard to watch, it pales in comparison as to what the ending chose to do. Holy mother of pearl, if I could give just the worst possible ending title to a movie, it would be this. Okay. Sorry. Let me explain to you what the ending is, because you probably don't understand why it's clearly upsetting me so much. So, the film chooses to end over a visual of a suffragette who died for the cause and plays some nice quotes over it. That seems like a pretty normal ending to a movie like this. I've now watched several for this history class. Just trust me, they all tend to end in similar ways. It's supposed to be poignant. Happy and poignant to show a message, you know. But, can you guess who this visual is for? Would you believe me if I told you a potential murderer? Well, okay. That isn't actually true historically, but that's legit what I thought when I was watching this movie. So apparently, someone forgot the notion that I'm going to remember the stuff your movie shows me for at least 5 minutes. When a man falls off of a horse and no one tells me he's okay, especially when the other lady in that incident died, I'm going to assume he died as well. So the whole time I'm supposed to be sad over this woman dying, I'm sitting there thinking about this poor innocent guy who had nothing to do with nothing, potentially in his grave, and no one caring. This isn't made any better by the fact that the woman in question, who isn't even on the IMDb page, got about 20 minutes of screen time. I didn't actually count, but all she really did was give the main character a book before dying. And You can't just make the emotional finale of a supposedly impactful movie show up 20 minutes before the credits. I was actually laughing when I saw them trying to make me care about this woman. And, it's a shame because, as a woman, I think the suffragette movement was important. But the movie portrays them as solely violent. I don't think they even went to a protest. Potentially murderous, morally bankrupt people, and then expects me to care because they represent a good message. You can't just let your characters get away with everything because of the message they present. It makes your movie poor. And ironically, the only actually decent characters in this movie are two males, one of whom supports but protects his wife Edith, the leader of the local suffrage group, and the aforementioned, not named, man, who seems like, although a bit pessimistic, like a realistic guy who's just trying to help Maud survive. These are not the main characters. These are not the people I'm supposed to be rooting for, but they were the only people who I saw as even slightly morally just. So, good job in making us care about your characters, movie. Yeah, you did good.